Thanks for dialing in today to Castle's webinar and our second chapter as we get deeper into Castle Safe Spaces, a framework for how to safely return employees to their work environment. My name is Daniel Lin. I am the CEO of Castle Systems. Today I'm joined by our Chief Product Officer, Todd Berner, and Jennifer Burns, the SVP of Property Management and Operations at Monday Properties. I will introduce them maybe in a little bit. Before we get started, when we started planning for this webinar last week, we wouldn't have foreseen any of the unrest that we're seeing in the streets across the country. These are for sure troubling times, and we support those voices of those calling attention to an issue that impacts so many, and while maintaining a sense of security and safety really for our communities. As a security company for Castle, these are issues that hit really close to home for us. And our thoughts are with all of those who are impacted, those families, those communities, our communities, as we strive for the kind of change that I think we all would want to see. With that said, our webinar today is about helping us to push deeper into getting our employees safely back to the workplace with respect to reoccupancy post the COVID-19 lockdown. As many of our communities are beginning to reopen, the reoccupancy efforts have taken recently a much more specific and practical turn. As these plans are becoming much more concrete, expectations are being set, being executed, or at least becoming very urgently needing to be executed on. We created Castle Safe Spaces now a couple of months ago as we looked to step into the void that we saw with our clients, with our buildings, our employers, our employees, who are all struggling with the just uncertainty of what to do as they contemplated reoccupancy. We dedicated now most of our company's resources towards supporting this idea and that reopening, bringing to bear what would be just a great 48-year history and expertise in systems and processes and technology to help put a framework together to help safely get employees back into the office. We have been really encouraged, honestly, just by the level of support and receptivity that we have gotten from our customers, from the market for Castle Safe Spaces. Following what I think was like 1,300 attendees to our prior webinars, we were excited to host today, I think almost 1,000 people registered for this one. And our hope is that this framework, our thinking, and today's webinar can continue to help us think deeper about specifically what we all can do, what you can do during this reoccupancy period. Todd, can I push the next page, please? Our goal today is just to offer the next level of practical advice. As I said, we have 3 objectives today that are nicely broken into the 3 different sections of the webinar. Some of you were on an earlier webinar with us, and I know some of you are new, so we want to start with a recap of the 4 pillars of Castle Safe Spaces, that framework, but just a quick update on recent learnings and continued evolution in our development to bring these capabilities into the market. Second thing is we are thrilled to have Jennifer Burns with us with Monday Properties. So we'll be spending some time with her as they have implemented most of the components of Castle Safe Spaces in one building and have really taken a leadership role and position in this market in terms of safely returning their workers into the office. And she'll share some perspectives on that they put in place. And then lastly, we're going to do a deeper dive on one pillar in the Safe Spaces framework that's called screen in and screen out. And this is one of the areas that has gotten such recent attention, maybe the most recent attention, with CDC and various states issuing guidelines and requirements to offices before they reopen. These requirements will require work, and we hope to share some suggestions about how to approach some of those considerations. With that, a couple of housekeeping items as we get into the substance of the webinar. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to submit them through the questions box, and we'll see if we can respond to the webinar. We've got an action-packed timeline here, so we might not get to all of them. Well, a question always comes up in these things about whether we're going to be sharing the deck, and we were going to do that. We'll give you a way to get in contact with us if you're interested to provide that presentation deck to you. I'll flip one more page here before I hand the mic over to Todd for a refresher on Safe Spaces. Many of you know Castle, but some of you may not be entirely familiar with us. We're drawing on our expertise again, as I said earlier, across our 48-year history, rich history in access control, video technology, some of the capabilities that we have in the bottom in this managed services security space and market that we know very well. We are a national company, I guess, in fact, an international company because we have operations in Australia. But in the US, we have boots on the ground in many of the major NFL cities like New York or Houston or LA, San Francisco, Chicago, just to name a couple of them. We're privileged to serve 3,600 buildings, 1.3 million cardholders, 41,000 businesses. And this breadth of perspectives gives us an especially good vantage point in how we see America getting back to work. When they're doing it, how they're doing it, how quickly they're doing it. And this is where I'll hand it over to Todd to start the story for how we are starting to see the country reopen. Todd?
So thanks, Daniel. So as Daniel said, because of the scope of the reach that Kastle has, we've got a view into how America is getting back to work. And so what we wanted to share here today was some of the early data around how we're seeing that occur. So as you look at this, you see the precipitous drop in mid-March, down to 10% occupancy. But we noticed as we started digging into the data that there are some regional differences in terms of both how low people got from an occupancy standpoint and how they've thought about coming back to work. So when you look at the green lines, the Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, and Austin, from a relative perspective, they didn't drop nearly as far as some other major cities, and they've been coming back a little bit faster than other regions. You look at Philly, DC, San Jose, they're in the gray bars, kind of in the middle. And then you've got places that were particularly hard hit and were particularly impacted early in the process, like San Francisco, Chicago, and New York, where you see those at a very low level and really not coming back quite at all. So what we're trying to do, because this data can be helpful for companies as they think about where are they in that reopening process, where are their tenants in that reopening process, we're going to be publishing this data on a weekly basis. So, here, the kind of the snapshot in the center, you can see over the last 3 weeks, what's been the average occupancy across the nation. And you notice the dip here, June 1st. We believe that that's because of the protests and curfews that have been put in place across the country. But we're going to be publishing this on a regular basis, and it can be a data point or an input to some of the planning that you have, whether you're a building or a tenant. But given that everyone really is beginning to think about how are we going to come back to the office, and as states remove some of their stay-at-home orders, we wanted to, as Daniel said today, to go a little bit deeper into some of the areas around Kastle Safe Spaces. So as a recap for those who may not have seen the framework before, we believe there are 4 pillars that every building, every tenant needs to have in place in order to bring their employees, their occupants back to work safely. So starting in the lower left, we need to make sure that we have touchless everything. We need to look at every part of the customer or the employee journey from the street, through the lobby, up the elevator, and into the tenant suite, and figure out where can we identify places where they have to touch something, whether that's a door, visitor processing, or even an elevator, and look for ways that we can turn that touchless. And we'll spend some time today talking about that. Next, we need to think about how are we going to make sure that we are doing everything that we can within the boundaries of regulations and rules to make sure that we're only allowing people back into the space who are healthy. And we'll share with you some data in terms of what the employees are expecting, but the sort of preview there is they are expecting that we as buildings, we as tenants are doing everything we can to screen out people who might be infected. Third is around social distancing. So everyone is familiar with the importance of staying 6 feet away from everyone else. And there are things that we can do from a visual marking standpoint, whether those are stickers on the floor, in the elevator, putting up stanchions. But there's also some technology things that we can do in terms of understanding occupancy of spaces like bathrooms before people enter that bathroom space. So we'll, again, talk more about that. And finally, the last important pillar we believe is contact tracing. If you look at some of the places around the world that have had the most success containing the spread of COVID-19, those are places that have done very rigorous testing and tracing. And as we kind of enter the next phase here of reoccupancy, the ability to identify somebody who may have been infected, quickly identify who else may have been exposed to them so that we can communicate that potential exposure, isolate them where appropriate, allow them to get the medical care that they need. That's going to be an important part of how we continue to flatten the curve and how we continue to give people confidence that it's safe to come back to the office. So we'll touch on each one of these, but as Daniel said, kind of go deepest on screen in and screen out today. So what we wanted to do now that we're 2-3 weeks into this, having shared these thoughts in a more formal venue like this, we wanted to give you an update in terms of where we're seeing a lot of customers focus their initial efforts in terms of implementing KastleSafeSpaces. So when it comes to screening in and screening out, certainly everyone is waiting for the day when there is widespread virus and antibody testing. But prior to that time, the question that is on everyone's mind is what kind of screening process can we put in place that's going to allow us to, with the greatest level of certainty, make sure that the people who come into our spaces are healthy. And so we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about what Kastle is doing to enable those screening processes to make sure that those who come into the building are safe. Second, there's been a lot of focus on touchless everything, and in particular around the importance of a mobile app experience, a mobile credential being the center of what creates a lot of these touchless experiences. So having the app that can open doors, having the app that control elevators, that's where there's been a lot of interest as people think about what visible signals can they show to their tenants, to their employees, that they're investing in the things that are going to keep and make those people safe. And elevators in particular have been a real point of focus, because when you think about getting through from the street up into the tenant suite, the elevator is probably the most constrained space we've got. So both how do we think about managing capacity, but also how do we avoid having people need to even touch the buttons to select the floor. Third, social distancing. We just talked a little bit about the elevator as the choke point, but in the last 2 weeks, I would say the topic that's come up most often as people begin to think about the reoccupancy is, how are we going to manage bathrooms? It's not a topic that everybody really thinks about all that often, but as we think about coming back to an office space and people thinking about, what the potential germs that exist in a bathroom, but there's a moment of unknown where, as you enter that bathroom, you may not know how many people are already inside there. So Kastle has spent time across the last 2 weeks designing kind of two-part solution for how we can help you manage bathroom occupancy. So one, through the Kastle Presence mobile app, being able to identify what is the current occupancy in the bathroom at that time. So before you even head over to the bathroom, knowing how many people are there, and is it, from your perspective, an appropriate time to try and move into the bathroom, we'd have that ability through the app. The second thing that we're exploring with some customers is, how can we use the access control on the bathroom itself to prevent people from going over whatever threshold is set? So if 5 is a threshold for the bathroom, making sure that when the 6th person arrives, the reader flashes red and there's a sign that lets them know that they're going to have to wait until somebody else comes out. So a lot of interest there as people think about that element of the reoccupancy. And third, we've seen a lot of buildings and tenants look back at some of their historical occupancy data. So looking at arrival times pre-COVID to understand, when did people historically arrive? What volumes did we see in 10-minute increments? Because even in phase 1 and 2, as we've got limited people coming back to the office, maybe we're not too worried about how we're going to get everyone through the lobby and up the elevators. But as we begin to get to the later stages of phase 2 and phase 3, having a deeper understanding of how people have historically come into the building can be an important input to that planning process. And on contact tracing, one of the most common requests that we've received from customers and even from prospective customers is adding exit readers to their existing access control system. So right now with access control, you have good data on when somebody arrived in a building. What you don't have in most cases is good data on when that person left the tenant suite or left the building. And that's where exit readers come in. So given the criticality of contact tracing, having the strongest set of data possible to identify who was in the building, when were they there, who else would have been there at the same time, having that data set becomes a critical part of being able to correctly identify anyone who may have been exposed and to be able to do the contact tracing investigations from there. The last thing that we'll share, just from an implementation standpoint, is the idea that there's no single right answer in terms of how these concepts are going to be implemented in a given space. We've spoken to some buildings who think it's entirely their perspective. We've spoken to some buildings that think it's none of their responsibility. And there's a lot of conversations in between. I think the recommendation, the guidance that we would have is, as you are building your return to work plans, if you haven't begun those conversations already, those are very important conversations to begin to set expectations around what that return is going to look like. being able to determine where will the screening be done, whose responsibility, and just having clear expectations will be an important part of that return to work process. So that's some of the things that we have seen from a kind of early conversations with customers and prospective customers around how the KastleSafeSpaces concepts are being initially implemented within their respective areas. So with that, let me turn it back over to Haniel to talk about a specific example with Monday Properties, one of the leading groups in terms of implementing KastleSafeSpaces.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. You're going to be able to hear a lot of these concepts that we talk about in conceptual form now, I think, applied. And so let me take advantage of that runway and shift to the second part of our webinar. We're really honored, privileged to have Jennifer Burns with us, who again is the SVP of Property Management Operations for Monday Properties. So Kastle and Monday have been partners for, gosh, a good 30 years, I think, Jennifer, that's right. But we are really excited to see you take such a strong position, you and the Monday leadership in thinking through how to get your workers safely back into your buildings. So Jennifer, you've also embraced the KastleSafeSpaces framework and more fully implemented those ideas in one location than any other building that we're working with. And so I'm sure the audience would appreciate a bit of a backstage pass to how you thought about it, how you got to some of the decisions, how you and the rest of the executive team there made some of the choices and the decisions that you ultimately made. So thank you so much for spending the time with us and for being here.
Hey, Haniel, thank you so much, and Todd, we appreciate the opportunity to partner with Kastle. As you said, we've had a 30+ year relationship with Kastle throughout our portfolio. Kastle was a tenant in one of our buildings for many years, and so we're excited for the partnership. And as we started to approach everything that was starting in early March, when stay-at-home orders started to go into place, we sat down as a leadership team and really had some tough conversations about what the next steps were going to be and what we were going to have to do in order to prepare our buildings and prepare our teams. And we wanted to make some be at the front of some of those decisions and early on make choices and provide documentation and materials to our tenants that would allow for them to have a roadmap as we navigated what the next steps look like. So it's never easy to kind of be at the front, but we felt very strongly that it was going to be important for our company and for our tenants in order to make those choices early on.
Yeah, no, that's super. I want to hear a little bit more about that for sure. Maybe just as a way to start. So describe Monday Properties, probably just a good foundation setter for everybody. And you are not only a building owner operator, but you also are an employer. So I'm sure folks would want to hear how you're thinking about returning your own employees back to work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as many people know, in the market, we are a large owner operator of commercial real estate. We also operate multifamily and build multifamily. So we have over 4 million square feet of office, trophy office and Class A office in this market. And so, we have a lot of employees, over 80 operations employees, within the divisions that I oversee in engineering, parking, and property management. And so, as an owner operator and an employer, we had to take a couple of different roles, right? So we've continued to have people working on rotations or in place, and we've had corporate staff that's in and out of the office. So we've really had to look at a lot of different ways as we strategize what a return to work looks like, reflecting on a building, reflecting on employees that are working within our buildings, and then also our employees that support corporate functions, for our company. So a little bit about us, but we do have a lot of divisions located in Roslyn at 1000 Wilson. So 1812 Northmore obviously is also in Roslyn, one of the 10 buildings we own in that particular submarket.
Awesome. Thank you for that background. So we're talking a bit about the strong leadership role that you are playing now in reoccupancy. I am sure I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in those executive meetings. You were sharing some of what you guys talked about and when you started to take on those conversations. I'm curious, just how did you guys decide to be as aggressive as you have become or are now in terms of pursuing this? What were the factors that led you to where you ended up going?
Couple of factors. So, we put together, a large document, a return to work guide that we released in early May. We wanted to get it out to our tenants, as quickly and thoughtfully as possible. This guide is customized for many of our buildings to show floor plans, but a lot of elements of that guide include signage, cleaning, engineering protocols. So a lot of information that was critical for us to get out, even as people weren't really even ready to start planning maybe what it looks like for them to be back at work. So, part of our thought process was it's a multitude of ideas that had to come together. And so we wanted to be at the front for our tenants. Top of mind continued to be safety and well-being for tenants and our own employees and the employees of our tenants. And then also for the market as a whole. We have, prided ourselves on being a leader in the commercial real estate space and providing, information and guidance to prospective tenants and to brokers in the larger community. And so I think that, it was an easy decision for us to make. It's not always, easy to be at the front of the line, if so to speak, but especially in a scenario where there's a lot of unknowns. But it really became critical, as we reflected, amongst our operations team and our leadership team on what approach we wanted to take. And being as proactive and putting as much information out there as possible was at the forefront and top of mind for us.
Yeah, I'm sure in the early conversations, you were probably talking about stuff that they weren't even thinking about, some of your tenants, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. I think that we were pretty early on into the discussion on what signage looks like, the dedicated entrance and exits, and things that we, know people hadn't quite gotten to yet. But we felt that if we took a strong position early on, both all of the different elements of what cleaning looks like, what engineering looks like, how contractors approach the building, and then sort of rolled it out in phases, that would allow our tenants to also thoughtfully partner with us on the approach. We also spent a lot of time talking to tenants, and we're continuing to do that through phone calls, distributing. We did a survey of our portfolio. We have another survey coming out that will kind of continue to capture a lot of really strong data points for us to understand, what's critical, as we continue to support both our own efforts and our tenants' efforts to return to work.
Yeah, I'm sure implicit in some of these conversations and how you're teaching your customers, your tenants, how to solve some of these problems. There has to be a business case in there that your leadership team might have been thinking about. I'm guessing maybe you can share some of that thinking too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that as a commercial real estate owner and operator, we wanted to have, information available that we could provide to prospective tenants as well. I mean, we think that as, the world continues to move forward with reoccupancy of some buildings, all of our buildings have continued to remain open and operating. But as tenants strategize, people are still going to continue to need space and they're still going to move. And, having this information available for our leasing associates and for our partners in the industry was important to us, so that we could continue to be at the cutting edge and kind of at the front of what the market looks like in feedback on helping tenants strategize what they're going to do moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. So now thinking about as employees and tenants are generally returning to work, what are you most focused on when it comes to that?
Certainly. So, as we surveyed our tenants, there are a lot of things that are top of mind, but sort of narrowing it down to our, health and safety, being our top priorities, cleaning, and sort of how tenants approach the building are sort of those touch points that are really important for our tenants. And so that was one of the things that we immediately focused on, was trying to be able to, provide solutions and information surrounding those items.
Do you have you've obviously been in your buildings now, maybe you can share a little bit of that. So what's the office, the new office post-COVID? What's the new Monday property office or building gonna feel like or look like?
It looks a little different than it did before, but a lot of colorful signage and directions. We have closed our revolving doors. We've created dedicated entrance and exits. We've added signage on the floors to provide directional guidance. We've also added, social distancing reminders and markers throughout. We've provided some guidance and recommendations on how tenants should utilize the elevators. There's stickers on the floors in those elevators. We also have some social distancing monitors through our security firm to help sort of manage, what occupancy looks like as people start to traverse the lobbies and sort of get used to changes that are occurring throughout all of our buildings. So a little different, but I think that it's going to be really helpful as people start to approach. We've also seen reductions in seating in some of our common areas and sort of changes in the configuration in order to promote social distancing appropriately.
Yeah, so one of the things I noticed when I was in your office, your building, I don't know how often buildings have personality, but I will say that your signage allows you to share some personality, and you're telling me about the jokes that you have on your signage now. I thought is a really cool way to kind of express the building, as I thought was really neat.
Absolutely.
So you've now implemented almost all of the pillars of KastleSafeSpaces in this property we're talking about, the 1812 North Morris Street location. Would love to have you share a little bit about how that works, and maybe more importantly, if you could share with the audience the why behind some of these ideas and why you decided to choose those particular action steps. And so maybe let's start with touchless. That's a good one. I think that's a centerpiece of what you've put together, we've put together with you. Maybe start with that one.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that naturally the progression for us as part of our return to work strategy focused on technology as sort of a phase 2. And so a natural progression for us was to start to look at the ways that our tenants approach the building. And so when we partnered with Kastle, we really focused on 1812. We looked at all the ways the tenants would approach the building and the various touch points in the building to make that experience touchless. And so utilizing technology in order to make that experience different for our tenants than it is today was very important to us. And so with existing technology and infrastructure, we were able to make changes that are going to allow our tenants to have, in our mind, a different and, obviously more touch-free experience in, and doors, turnstiles, etc.
And Jennifer mentioned using the existing infrastructure. Kastle's been spending a lot of time with customers where you might already have an ADA door that has an automatic door opener on it, but there may still be a physical push pad to actually open that door. So, looking at the left-hand side of the screen, we can install wave openers so that you can make that part touchless as well. And then with turnstiles, being able to use a mobile credential to have a hands-free experience, those are places where removing that touch becomes an important part of giving people confidence to come back to the office.
You want to click forward there?
Great. So the next component for us, which we envision as sort of the next phase of implementation of, the KastleSafeSpaces pillars, is this touchless elevator technology. And so, utilizing some of the existing equipment that we have through our Otis elevators, we would be able to, allow tenants in a normal elevator protocol that's not destination dispatch to have a touch-free experience. And so, while we're still working on the implementation of this, I think this is also, again, a natural progression for us on continuing to implement touch-free technology within the building.
And one of the things that Kastle has been doing is working very closely with Otis and other elevator manufacturers to figure out how can we make that touchless. And in particular, the challenge is, how do you make the elevator touchless when somebody can go to multiple floors? And that's the most challenging part of this, because if you're on a single floor, you can program the system to take you to that single floor. But if you've got the ability to go to multiple floors in a tenant space, or to be able to use amenity floors or other places, having that choice is what makes controlling the elevator difficult. And so as we've been working with Otis, very excited about the progress we've made live with destination dispatch elevators, as well as with non-destination dispatch elevators. So we'll share here a video from the Monday property in terms of some of the initial proof of concept that we've got here. So with the app, able to call up the floors that you have access to be able to select that, hit the call elevator button, which allows you to basically say whether you're going up or down. That brings the elevator to you. This is a non-destination dispatch elevator. Get inside the elevator, mobile app communicates with the elevator, calls the floor, and away you go. So very excited about this. We'll have the destination dispatch version out probably in the next week or two. And then the non-destination dispatch with Otis probably in early to mid-July, and then very quickly following with other elevator companies shortly thereafter. So just very excited about this, and very excited to be partnering with Monday on some of these opportunities.
Great. So the next component for us that was also really important was harnessing some of the existing technologies we had through our visitor management system to further support the touchless experience by using visitor management through KastleSafeSpaces. So tenants would be able to enable their visitors to access their space through, an app-based technology, and that's going to continue to allow less interaction from a touch perspective, from signing in, or potentially having to have additional touch points as they authorize visitors to access the building.
And as we get into the third part of the conversation here, we'll talk about how we can bring screening questions into the visitor experience as well, so you can actually combine the screening questions with the touchless visitor experience.
If I don't mind, just Todd, if I could interrupt you. So there's a quick question here. That's what happens if for some reason the technology fails. I'm guessing this is elevator technology here. What's the fallback or recovery? How will the elevators be used, et cetera?
So the mobile control is an overlay on top of the elevator system that exists today. So we're not disabling any of the buttons what's inside the elevator, so you would always have access to those. What we're doing is adding an overlay on top of that that allows somebody through a mobile app to be able to indicate the direction of travel and the destination that they're going to without needing to press any of the physical buttons on the elevator hallway or within the elevator car itself.
Thank you.
Great. So the next component here from a screening perspective involves a setup of the thermal cameras. We do have a sample of this that we put at 1812 North Moore's lobby. We're continuing to literally and figuratively take our tenants' temperatures related to what this is going to look like as we consider different types of technologies that we're implementing, as I'm sure lots of landlords are. This is a big question. And so, we've been, demoing it and kind of understanding what it looks like, as we plan for the next phase of the reoccupancy implementation of the various technologies as part of KastleSafeSpaces.
And I think consistent with where Monday Properties is, the conversations we've been having with customers are still in some of the earlier stages. But the nice thing about these kinds of configurations is you can either have them stand alone and have somebody monitoring that and pulling people aside where appropriate, or you could actually integrate it with something like a turnstile and lock the turnstiles if somebody had an elevated temperature. So there's some flexibility in terms of how you can deploy these kinds of technologies.
Great. And so then in addition to that, we have put in exit readers at 1812, and we intend to follow through in other buildings in our portfolio, which will allow for a couple of different data points to be gathered. And so that includes kind of managing social distancing, because we're able to provide better occupancy data of how many people are in our building at one time and understand what that looks like. And then also support efforts of contact tracing, which we continue to hear feedback from tenants as it relates to, positive cases of COVID-19, how we notify, what that looks like, and where people have been. So the usage of that exit reader is going to check a couple of different boxes, which is one of the reasons why we made the decision kind of to implement it throughout our portfolio.
Yeah, in addition to the contact tracing portion of it, which is absolutely critical, it does allow for some enforcement around social distancing, because what the access control system can do, we can count the entries and the exits into a given space. So you could set a threshold where you would say, for example, no more than 50 people can be in the space. By having, you can do it with just entry reads, by the time you get to 50, we could send an alert. But by having exit reads as well, you get a much more accurate count, so you know exactly how many people are in that space, and you can send the alert only when it's appropriate. So a lot of value from a social distancing perspective, from a contact tracing perspective, and even from a building operations perspective. Kastle is integrated with third-party building management systems, and you can use that real-time occupancy data to actually manage some of the heating, cooling, lighting within the space based on where people are. So there's a lot of value that gets created by knowing when people leave in addition to when people arrive.
So thank you both for the rundown there. I'm just keeping an eye to the time here. There are questions coming in. I'm gonna I'll keep some of the more specific ones, and we'll come back to you guys after the fact. Maybe Jennifer, if you could allow me just maybe one or two questions here just to finish this up. I think a big one we talked about, as Todd introduced the section earlier, is navigating the conversations with tenants in the building about what they expect, what they need, how you would be able to help them. What advice would you share with others, other property owners, operators, about how to get into this discussion, maybe how you did some of that?
Certainly. So I think that it's really critical as, a building owner and a property manager to, really start to engage, if you haven't already, in conversations with your tenants, one-on-one conversations, surveys. There's just so much information that you can gather from what people are planning to help you make your own plans. And so it's really critical as you're strategizing for what your own building looks like and what that reoccupancy looks like, to listen to the tenants and solicit that feedback, because every building is going to be unique.
Yeah, and that partnership, that conversation, I think is really important. And I think consistently across all of my conversations with both sides of the house, if you will, the building side, but also the employer side, it's just an active dialogue about how you implement some of that, for sure. I'll finish up with this last question, Jennifer, if you don't mind. So looking ahead, how do you anticipate ensuring the continued safety of our collective workspaces? How would you think about that for us?
I mean, I think that for us, it's continuing to implement these various phases and, reacting to as the Commonwealth and, local and federal guidance comes out, as, we venture into reoccupancy, continuing to strategize and be at the front end of sort of what different technologies are available, partnering with, industry leaders, and, making smart choices as it relates to investments in technology and like simple changes to the operations of your buildings. I mean, there's going to be a lot of different ways that things are going to change, and then some things that are going to stay the same, but it's really critical to take a very holistic approach on how you operate your building today, what changes, how your engineers approach, tenant work orders, how your parking staff operates. There are going to be a lot of components to that. So we think that it's really critical to really look at how you operate it today, or in a pre-COVID environment, and then really dig deep into what it looks like, in a post, COVID kind of reoccupancy strategy, so that everybody's, health and well-being, continues to be top of mind. And putting that information out there for your tenants is going to be really critical.
Very good. Well, let's call it at that. I'm sure we could do this for hours and hours. You got such great insights and experience in implementing some of these ideas in your conversations with your own leadership team, but also with your building tenants and employees. All fascinating and all really helpful, I think, to all of us who are on the phone. So thank you again to Jennifer Burns from Monday Properties. Real privilege to have you as a partner. Thank you for being with us here today and for sharing some of the ideas and insights. Let's shift to the third section of the webinar, and I'll turn it back over to Todd to go deeper into the screen in, screen out pillar of the KastleSafeSpaces framework.
Oh, thanks, Daniel. I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is probably the area where we're seeing the most heat in the marketplace, the most interest in the marketplace right now. And I think there's two factors, a push and a pull, that's causing it to be so top of mind for most people. On the push side, you've got institutions like the CDC recommending that daily in-person or virtual health checks occur, and they're encouraging them to occur before they get to the facility. If it's going to happen in the facility, making sure that there are multiple screening places available so that you're maintaining social distancing. So, we've got regulatory bodies encouraging us to do daily testing in person or remote. And then the poll is the employee side. So those of you who were on the last webinar may remember this data, but we surveyed over 1,000 employees in late April to understand what are they going to want to see before they come back to work. And two of the most highly sought after items that people want to see before they're going to feel comfortable coming back to work is, one, denying infected individuals before they come into the office, and two, denying symptomatic individuals. So the way you read the chart, the black bars represent what percent of people would say that that was a showstopper if it wasn't in place. So nearly 7 out of 10 people said they wouldn't go back to an office if they didn't know that people who were infected were denied access. And nearly 7 out of 10 said that even if the person was symptomatic, they want them to be denied. So we've got both from the regulatory side and from the employee side, a lot of interest around screening. And now what we're beginning to see as we get closer to phase 1 and phase 2 of reoccupancy, you're seeing a lot more guidance at the state level around what is going to be expected of buildings and of tenants as we go into that reoccupancy phase. So using New York as an example here, New York has spelled out that there are different responsibilities. As we think about commercial real estate, New York has said that the building owner is going to be responsible for unleased space in common areas, and the tenant's going to be responsible for their leased space unless, and this is the point we were making before, there's an agreement with the building and the tenants around how they're going to divide that responsibility. But if you look at the left-hand side of the page, as it pertains to commercial real estate and professional office spaces, New York is expecting that there's going to be mandatory daily health checks to ensure that both for employees, and you can see here, where practicable, visitors are being screened to make sure that they are healthy before they come into that office space. Now, consistent with the CDC guidance, we're seeing a lot of states, New York included, that are saying they want the ability for that screening to take place before somebody even gets to the office. Now, we don't want long lines of people queuing up to be screened only to have some of them sent home who potentially could have infected others by arriving there. And then last, we're seeing guidance coming out at the state level around what needs to be screened for. So New York is looking for things like, have you been around somebody who has been diagnosed? Have you tested positive yourself? Do you have symptoms? So each state is providing different guidance, and that's kind of what you see on the right-hand side. So we've gone through and looked at all of the different state regulations as of yesterday and looked at them and said, okay, are these, as it pertains to corporate real estate, are these states requiring some sort of screening process? Are they recommending some sort of screening process, or have they not made any guidance? And just to be clear, for states that haven't made guidance on this chart, it's not to say they haven't made guidance for sectors like retail or hospitality. Oftentimes there are guidance there, but there's no current guidance as it pertains to commercial real estate. So, you know, sort of the takeaway here, we're seeing the trend towards states giving more guidance around what's expected for reoccupancy. And so therefore we've spent a lot of time thinking about how can we create the ideal screening process for both employees and for visitors.
There's a clarifying question here, Todd. Is New York insisting on temperature checks?
So New York is not insisting on temperature checks. They're saying that it is encouraged, but they're not requiring temperature checks. So most where states have recommended or required guidance, they're often encouraging, though not always, but often encouraging temperature checks, but not necessarily requiring those.
It's the screening questions.
Actually, I should clarify one thing. Oftentimes they are requiring an individual to self-certify that they have done a temperature check and they do not have a fever. My answer to you actually was, are they requiring buildings or tenants to physically check somebody's temperature in the building or tenant space? And that's where there's not as much of a requirement.
Thank you. Yep.
So, you know, as we think about what those checkpoints can look like, you know, we laid this out here, and again, each situation is going to be different. The configuration of the lobby is going to be different. The responsibilities between buildings and tenants will be different. So, you know, we've shown a stylized example here of a lobby where you've got a checkpoint, you've got your social distancing. They come in, they answer their screening questions, they, you know, get their temperature checked. Same thing can occur at the tenant suite. How you think about that, whether it's questions only, whether it's questions plus temperature, temperature only, you know, those will be decisions that each building and tenant will need to make. But we're trying to build a platform and an access control architecture that allows you to leverage each of those different components. So, you know, on camera specifically, Daniel, to your question, we're currently implementing 3 different types of thermal cameras depending on the situation. So in areas like a lobby where you want to get a lot of people through at a relatively rapid pace, that's where we're doing more of the high throughput systems. The example that Jennifer was sharing from Monday Properties would be an example of that kind of a camera. In other places where either you're less concerned about the traffic or you want to make sure that you're getting a very good read on somebody's temperature, we can set up kiosks in the lobby or actually mount one on the wall at the tenant suite. So the idea would be, until you've been checked and shown that you don't have an elevated temperature, your credential is not going to work for that day. So we do have the ability to integrate those things. But where I wanted to spend time was on the questions and the mechanisms for doing that self-certification.
I can interrupt you for 1 second. Back to the navigating the conversation between building and tenant. This is probably a better one for Jennifer, if you don't mind. So there's a question that came in, is it the building owner's responsibility to hire and pay the people manning the various stations, I think that Todd was showing before? How might you just, if you have any advice about navigating that kind of a conversation, because I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer to it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a clear-cut answer right now. I mean, everybody's going to approach kind of what the requirements are of their building a little bit differently, and, you know, what kind of employees they're utilizing. So, you know, to the extent that there's security staff used, that's going to be part of like a normal operating expense, you know, that you would use some existing staffing, that, you know, some of the technology components are going to be part of like regular fees that we would pay to Castle. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to the question, but I think there's a couple of different ways you could approach it, you know, depending on what type of staffing that you're going to use for it.
Yep, thank you.
So on the screening questions themselves, we've spent time thinking about how can we enable people to certify that they are healthy to come back to the building each day, but not have to do it necessarily in person. So this would be additive to, not a replacement for, screening at the building. But 2 things to keep in mind as we go through this. So one is that for this whole process to work, it's going to work best if you've got access control in place 24/7 for both the lobby and the tenant suite. You have to have some place where the individual is not going to be able to get in when their credential is inactive, which is the second point. You know, we're recommending and working with customers to actually deactivate everyone's credential each evening. and only activate the credential for that individual once they've certified that they are indeed healthy. So as we've thought about this, there are 4 principles that we've adopted as we've created our solution here, and we think differentiates it from other standalone screening options out in the marketplace. So 1, there just has to be an ability for somebody to screen themselves wherever they are. So for an employee, a mobile app is going to make the most sense because it's on their phone, it's with them, and available on demand whenever they need it. For a visitor, it's probably going to be an email because a visitor is not going to have downloaded the app because they probably don't come to the building often enough to justify that. And we know exactly when they're going to be coming, so we don't have to worry about sending them an email every day that just becomes noise when it's not relevant. So being able to give people the ability to screen themselves before they get to the building is an important part. Second, we need to have clear and unambiguous screening criteria that people are evaluating themselves against. So here we've shown some examples. We're building the platform to be configurable because we recognize that each state is going to be different, each building and each tenant is going to be different. We're happy to provide recommendations and guidance on the questions, but we're building the platform such that you, who know your policies and what you need the best, can set it up to be how you want it to operate. But it does need to be very clear. There can't be any questions around, if it's written as, were you in an area that had a COVID outbreak? That becomes a judgment call. So we really want to make sure the questions are very clear. Third, whatever we're doing in terms of sending out screening on a daily basis, either through apps or through registered visitors, it's going to be a lot easier and more secure if that system is integrated with your system of record. For tenants, that's often an Active Directory system, but whatever it is, wherever you are onboarding and offboarding employees, that's going to be a great place to connect because that'll handle a lot of the automation for emails, and it also improves security. When that person is terminated, that access credential automatically gets deactivated. But last, and this is the part where as an access control company, we feel very strongly about this, there has to be some enforcement mechanism on these screening questions. Because if you simply are certifying yes or no, I'm healthy or not, but you can still go into the office place, then you haven't created the environment that both the CDC and the employees are looking for. And so making sure that only once the person agrees, whether they're an employee or a visitor, only then does the access credential become active. So most of you probably understood that, but just kind of pictures to bring it to life. So from an employee perspective, sitting at home, screening off the app, saying, yes, I'm okay, that activates the credential. And then from here, the scenarios could be different. Some places will set up a fast pass lane to be able to skip whatever screening process may be in place at the building. Go over to the guard, show that you're already pre-approved, get the temperature check, and move on into the building. Same thing with the visitor flow. So here, the way the visitor management system would work, a person invites their visitor, sends an Outlook or a Google Calendar invite, includes visitor@kastle.com. That triggers our system to send an email questionnaire out, again, configurable, to the visitor that they have to certify, yes, indeed, I am healthy. That's the I agree step. Only then is the credential sent to them, which then gives them access to the space. So, believing that it's important that those elements come together to make sure that only people who have certified that they are healthy can access the space. And then last, as we look through a lot of the state guidance, New York being one of them, we're seeing requirements at the state level that companies maintain records of what the responses were for the surveys or the self-questionnaires that they send out each day. So, with the screening questions as part of the Kastle Presence app, being able to track at an individual level, did the person agree or disagree, what day, what time, and then even being able to take it a step further and seeing on the lockout report, if we deactivated somebody's credential, did they still try and come in? Because this creates not only a compliance capability for any state regulations or local regulations that might exist, but it allows for an enforcement of corporate policies. So if there's a corporate policy that says you have to confirm that you are healthy every day you come in, if you find out at a future date that the person misrepresented their health status, you now have documentation that will make it easier to take whatever action would be appropriate based off of your corporate policy. So we're spending a lot of time trying to build this capability out. We've got the visitor capability ready today. So, those of you Castle front office customers or those of you considering it, we can turn on the screening question for registered visitors now. For employees, we're currently building out the app portion of that and expect to have that in early July. So actively working on it given the energy that we're seeing in the marketplace around those screening questions.
Hey Todd, there is a clump of questions I should just ask, since they're all kind of roughly the same. So roughly the question is, what's to stop somebody from agreeing when they should not? Yeah. And even if they're asymptomatic, there's no way to truly know whether somebody is prevented from coming in. And sure. Then there's a related question as well. There are a lot of questions around that question. There's a related question of whether they're, oops, sorry, I lost that one. Whether that protects them from a liability standpoint if somebody basically says yes when they shouldn't have, and how does that protect the organization? I think it goes to the risk nature, basically, of what these questions surface or prevent.
Right. So from a screening perspective, the best screen is going to be when we have widely available virus and antibody testing, because then you can definitively know at that point in time, is that person currently sick, or have they already been sick and therefore may not be able to be contagious again. So that's kind of the ultimate goal. Until that is available, then the question becomes, what's the best that we can do given the current state of the technology? So with the screening questions, I guess there is some art in how you write the questions. So you are correct that people can be contagious before they are asymptomatic, but the CDC is providing guidelines around what they believe the current symptoms to be. And so by including those in the questions, you're reducing the risk as far as possible by being able to have somebody identify, yes, I do have a cough, yes, I have lost a sense of smell, and to be able to screen themselves out of the process even before they've got a definitive diagnosis. So it's about mitigating the risk and bringing it down as low as you can, recognizing that it won't be perfect. Then there was the question in there around what's to stop somebody from agreeing to the questions when they know that they're not sick, or they know they are sick. There's nothing, and that's at least nothing in the app itself, but I think this is where corporate policies become an important part of this, because if the policy at the corporate level says, you by certifying each day, that you are healthy, you are making a material representation to the company around the status of your health, and that's part of your continued employment. If we determine that you knowingly misled the organization, there can be consequences, and the consequences can vary based on the corporate policy. But I think you're going to find that it's a combination of the mechanism to do the screening and to record the answers and the policy that sits around it to make sure that there's an understanding around how the information will be used, especially in a case where somebody is known to have willfully misled the company.
Yeah, the only thing I might add to that is we spend a lot of time with experts on this issue across the board, and one epidemiologist said to me, like, there is basically, even with testing, no 100% guarantee that you're zero defect, that there will be zero chance of something happening. And I think as we think about the various component parts of Castle Safe Spaces, these are all risk reducers as you implement different parts of it. And so even if you started with the screening questions as to whether somebody can affirm or attest that they are clear of that, you can further put other screens in place or tests in place, like the thermometer or thermal camera scan. Those are all different parts, and the more you put behind it, the more comfortable that you'll be. But this is ultimately a risk reduction measure rather than necessarily a risk elimination with zero chance of anybody coming through. That this will not happen, cannot happen with this.
Right. That's exactly right. It's a layering approach to try and bring that risk down as low as possible, while balancing the fact that we need to get people back to work, and we need to get them through the lobby and through the elevators and into the suite as fast as we can while doing it safely.
Good. Just watching a clock, I said probably should allow you to finish up.
Yeah. So just kind of recapping again, the 4 pillars: screen in, screening out, and using the access control in whatever form makes sense, whether it's with screening questions like we described, adding in thermal cameras, and at some future date adding in testing to make sure that we've done as much as we can to make that space safe. Touchless everything, using the mobile app like Castle Presence to be able to automatically open doors, to control elevators, and to see the space and the occupancy within that space. Social distancing, using technology to enforce arrival times or to enforce schedules to make sure that people are only in the space when they should be there, and monitoring that occupancy in real time. And finally, the contact tracing, the importance of having those exit readers, having the data to know who was in the space, when did they arrive, when did they leave, who else was there, becomes a critical element in any contact tracing initiative if there is ever a potential or suspected exposure. So with that, let me turn it over to Haniel just to kind of close us out here.
Yeah, so thanks again to Jennifer and to Todd for joining today and helping us to lead the discussion. Thank you to all of you who dialed in to this. Again, we are going to make the presentation available, so please just get in touch with your account manager or with just email to info@kastle.com, and you can get access to the presentation. We're also going to create a link to this recorded session so that you can have access to it. As I have said in many of my conversations with various of you all out there, this is a journey that we're on. This is a journey that gets more and more specific as we get clearer and clearer on the guidance, as we look to get folks back into the office. We are certain that there is a way to be smart and to get people back into work in a safe way. And so it is our privilege and our honor to be able to help you think through some of these issues and to work through that specifically. And a lot of that will depend on the conversations, as we heard from Jennifer, as we touched here earlier, and even as we heard and saw from the New York State guidelines about that navigation of responsibility and conversation. But a conversation needs to be had or nothing will get done. So from our standpoint, we are here to help. To the degree that we can be helpful, please don't hesitate again to get in touch with your contact or your account manager, or to email us at info@kastle.com. Thanks very much for your time today, and please, everybody out there, stay safe, and thank you again.